let's make the most of it. Okay. Let's start with one of the gentlemen at the back, and then there's a lady here at the front. Let's take two at a time, one on each side. So would you like to kick off?
Thank you very much.
And sorry, there's a rule which I've been asked if you wouldn't mind, or if I could apply, which is when you before you ask a question, could you just say who you are, and if you wish, who you represent, if you feel you're representing a particular organisation. Thank you.
Jerry Proctor, representing myself from Liverpool. Thank you very much for your interesting talk tonight. I wonder if you'd be able to make a comment on the presidency of Mary MacAleese in regard to peace in Northern Ireland, given the current context from the British perspective of the disintegration of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And Mary MacAleese in her autobiography speaks very movingly of how she invited Unionists from the North regularly to come in groups to the presidential mansion in Dublin and worked with them. It seems that she was putting into practice something quite extraordinary that would not bear results in the short term. And I wondered if this fitted in any way into your concept tonight about hope as a very much a long-term prospect.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll take the second question, and then we'll, if that's okay.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Can you hear me?
No.
I'll try and project. My name's Kat Jenkins, and I'm from Church Action for Tax Justice. And it's a bit of a... Bless you, thank you. Thank you. It's a bit of a double header. That doesn't sound much better, actually. You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Very good. You talked about part of that process involving reconciliation, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role of repentance within that context of reconciliation, of accepting accountability, if not blame, and accepting the privileged existence many of us have that rides on the back of trauma for the majority world. And secondly, in the context of these frameworks that you were discussing within the UN, within other agencies, do you have any thoughts on the role of lobbying in those arenas? Because there can be civil society organisations pressing the voice of those in need, but there can also be those representing the interests of those who are purely about capitalism and profit. And it's at the moment it seems to be a largely unregulated or insufficiently regulated arena.
Okay, thank you, Kat. So we have a question largely around Mary MacAleese and her leadership in respect to the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement and its current unravelling. And a second question about the repentance and lobbying. Philip.
Those are very interesting questions. On the Good Friday Agreement, I think the first thing I would say is that it was very well conceived at the time. And it's more stable than some people, I think, sometimes imagine, because it really only offers two scenarios for the future. One is Northern Ireland is British, but with very strong recognition of the Irish identity, or vice versa, that it's in some way connected with our state, but with very strong protection for the British identity in Northern Ireland. So it isn't as though the future has been left open to any kind of imagined alternative. You know, Northern Ireland, bluntly, was not given self-determination under the Good Friday Agreement, but it is an organised solution with these different dimensions: internal, north, south, east, west. It makes a lot of sense. It would be very hard to think of any alternative framework then or now. to that framework. Now that said, it has always been hoped that some kind of friendship would develop among all the parties concerned, which would mean that without any bitterness or instability, that possible changes could occur. There could be evolutionary change within Northern Ireland, or ultimately a change in constitutional arrangements, but it shouldn't be seen as sudden or traumatic for anybody. That's the vision, at least. And I think it's really worth holding on to that, and I think there are definitely solutions available under the protocol, which would be win-win for everyone and very good for the economy of Northern Ireland. And paradoxically, it might give the Unionists more reassurance, because it would make more people happier with Northern Ireland as it is. So I wouldn't give up on the possibility of resolving these current tensions around the agreement. Now, I have great admiration for the role of President McAleese and her husband, Martin, he was in fact the Chancellor of DCU when I was invited into Dublin City University to establish this centre. And I think that what they have been trying to do is part of a much broader effort to create what the Church of Ireland Archbishop of Armagh calls social friendship in Northern Ireland, on the island and between the two islands, without prejudice to any particular political agenda. And of course the Irish government has this shared island policy, which is also without prejudice to any political changes in the future, but it's to try to find as much common ground and mutual regard as possible. And as I said at the beginning, our centre is very fortunate to have been asked by the Irish Council of Churches to work as a partner. And the Irish Council of Churches is Protestant and Orthodox churches on the island, and their centre of gravity is in Northern Ireland. And I was invited as an academic guest to the annual meeting of the Irish Council of Churches in the Methodist Skynos Centre in Belfast, which was a great honour. I was very moved to be there. And the entire theme of that annual meeting of the Irish Council of Churches a few months ago was the unfinished work of peace. So I think the Good Friday Agreement has a lot going for it. And I think you're right to draw attention to the kind of work that President McAleese and others have been doing. And now on the question of how international conferences function, I think the most important thing is to have the right agenda, because at the moment many of the most important issues, monetary policy or armaments, the armaments industry and the arms trade, or the extraordinary power of corporations in the global economy, beyond, it would seem, what we usually understand as democratic control, those issues are not properly addressed within multilateral diplomacy. Also, the most crucial changes in the world of technology, which include these interventions in the genome, which some people claim will change what it means to be human, these are being driven by investors, and there's no adequate multilateral framework. So it seems to me the first responsibility of governments is to create adequate frameworks where the most consequential issues are addressed. Now the EU has made progress in some areas, such as data protection and the regulation of these platforms, of the social media. But what that says to me is there's so much more that could be done. I think there's a real structural problem both in diplomacy and in democracy, that the most consequential issues are not being addressed. So I think the lobbying is kind of a secondary issue. Of course, there's huge power in the hands of lobbyists. But I think if governments were able to structure the negotiating process in a better way, that the lobbyists would hit the buffers soon enough. Now, but repentance and forgiveness, I think sometimes forgiveness comes first, I mean, the Queen shook hands with Martin McGuinness, even despite the IRA murder of Lord Mountbatten. And that had enormous resonance, but it wasn't a negotiated thing where there had to be a demonstration of repentance, but everyone knows what it meant. And I think, first of all, forgiveness comes first, and then I think secondly, that the form that forgiveness takes is to work on the welfare of people, to create these forms of cooperation which will give the next generation hope, in a very basic sense, that they have somewhere to live and a job and healthcare and so on. So I think reconciliation, repentance and those things, they should be approached, I think, indirectly through meaningful politics. And I'm tempted to make one other big structural point in all of this, but I think we're too accustomed to the idea that the market works and then the state comes in afterwards with a safety net. Since you mentioned taxation, we see taxation policy as a remedy for an intolerable situation that has emerged in the open market. But what we have to recognise is that the individual decisions taken by the actors in the market, by banks or investors or professional people or whatever companies, that they have a moral character in themselves. It's not enough to say that my economic decision is efficient within a given framework, but it has an intrinsic character also which impacts, for example, on the environment or on personal relationships. And I come back to Pope Benedict again, because this is, I think, the big development in Caritas in Veritate, where the Pope says that the distinction between for-profit and not-for-profit activity is not a satisfactory distinction under modern conditions. So he's opening up a whole debate there, which I think we all have to take very seriously, because everything that was true at the time of Caritas in Veritate has become even more obvious now.
Okay, thank you, Philip. If you're interested in tax, Kat will be running a workshop tomorrow, so and maybe more than once, I'm not sure. Okay, so let's have some more questions. I'm going to take 3 in the hope that we can get through all 3 and maybe more. Yes, please, thank you. And then yes, and then I'll take those 3 if I may. Yeah.
I'd like to. My name's David Rhodes.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I'm representing anybody apart from 9 grandchildren. I was deeply impressed by your speech. I didn't understand most of it, but I got the gist. Some things jumped out at me. I'm not a Catholic, so I don't know who Benedict was, but he sounds to have been a good guy. You use phrases like incoming decades and the need for time in order for friendships to develop and relationships, and you talk about longer time frames. My only hope is that my grandchildren will live on a habitable planet, and the decisions that we're going to make that happen are needing to be taken in the coming months or the next 2 or 3 years. We do not have time, and we are faced by organisations, commercial, industrial, military, whose vested interests are so powerful that it is difficult to know how we can hold them. If there's any way in which diplomacy or your knowledge can help this situation, I really think we could do with it, because if we don't stop climate change in the next 2 or 3 years, none of this really will matter.
Thank you. Thank you for your question and for representing your 9 grandchildren. Okay, next question, please. And if we could make them as sharp as possible, that would just help us get through. Thank you.
My name is Eric Pearce, and I represent myself and my family. The United Nations clearly has a crucial potential role in any international events, but it's dogged by the fact that members have a veto on the Security Council, which really seems to paralyse any sort of action. Do you see any way of getting around this?
Thank you, Eric. Good question. And then yes, did you have the microphone? No. Could we have the microphone over here, please? Thank you very much.
Steve Atherton from Liverpool Archdiocese, sorry, not representing anybody really. In the context of what's happening in Ukraine that we're all very aware of at the moment, I wonder what you see the prospects for a rational conversation and cooperation after a long and bloody war.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so 3 questions. One about a topic where there isn't a lot of time. The second about the problem of the 6 Security Council members having a veto. Is there a solution to that? And then how and when does the talking begin in Ukraine? Thank you.
Well, on the question of time, you know the phrase, better to light a candle than curse the darkness. You know, I agree with you, we're in a very desperate situation, but then I suppose you have to ask what we can do. And I come back to this idea that we're uncovering the sources of creation, and maybe what we do now will enable something that we don't see quite at the moment. But I think we have to do something, and what we were suggesting in our book was a certain reorganization of how international negotiations happen, moving towards a stronger regional dimension to global diplomacy, and using that as a way into strengthening the UN, and then within those regional frameworks doing things in a different way. So you're trying to just take the next possible step. And that brings me to the question of the UN. I think the Security Council does need to be reformed, not only in terms of the veto, but also in terms of the membership. And what's happening at the moment in practice is that governments are looking for ways to bypass that problem by creating other viable processes in the UN. So the UN Secretary General has this common agenda proposal for a World Social Summit in 2025. And I think the hope would be then that some of this regional work could feed into such a social summit. I agree with you, you've identified the problem, and the question is how to address it. Again, it's about lighting a candle instead of cursing the darkness. I think one other approach would be to look very thoroughly at where you can find the common ground with China, because the Chinese have actually published quite a lot about what their vision is, and we often hear very dismissive statements without people really looking into what they're suggesting. Now, Pope Francis, I think, is an exception because he's still hoping to continue this arrangement with the Chinese Communist Party, for which he's much criticised about the appointment of bishops. But I think what the Holy See is trying to enable is some kind of dialogue with China in the future. I spent a semester in Princeton a few years ago, and I met with 3 Chinese scholars who had come to the United States in order to study Western political philosophy. One of them, who is based in Hong Kong, has written a beautiful book about Confucius, and how you could find elements in Confucius which you can place in dialogue with Western liberal democracy. And I think that's something we should work on, instead of assuming that China will never be amenable to rational decisions. China has a reasonably serious record, I think, within the UN. What is happening internally on some issues, of course, might be different. And that brings me to the question of Ukraine. And I think there are three sources of what you rightly call, I think, a rational discussion. One would be the principles of the Helsinki Final Act, the 10 principles. I think if we look at how those principles have been implemented, I think we find that they've been widely ignored by many actors. The Helsinki Final Act commits all the governments in Europe to all kinds of things which we seem to have forgotten about. Economic cooperation is a value in itself, and non-interference is a value. There was a principle about the territorial integrity of states, which the Soviet Union thought would protect its own state, and we set that aside both for Yugoslavia and for the Soviet Union without any compensatory measures, and so on. So the Helsinki principles could be the basis of a rational discussion. I think the second basis would be the Minsk agreements, 2014, 2015, which would have given a special position to Donetsk and Luhansk within the Ukrainian state, which would in turn have softened for Russia the implications of Ukraine joining the European Union, because those regions of Ukraine would have ensured that traditional relations across the border with Russia would have continued. So when I was in Moscow as ambassador, as recently as 2013, there were discussions about whether it was wise to present Ukraine with a binary choice between being European, quote-unquote, or being part of the former Soviet space. So people were thinking about that, and then the Minsk agreements reflect that kind of thinking. And I think a third source for me of a rational discussion would be to look at the Northern Ireland peace process. Because in the Northern Ireland peace process, of course, there's a big territorial compromise, the partition of the island. There is a very strong pluralism, respect for different identities, which is now completely absent. The Ukrainians have no time for any Russian dimension in their society, which began before the invasion. And the Russians have never recognized Ukrainian identity. I think there are, at least at the beginning of the war, there were 4 million Ukrainians working in Russia. And in the Northern Ireland peace process, we also have this openness to future change. So you don't have to achieve everything you'd like to achieve just here and now. And also with the Northern Ireland peace process, you have this enormously supportive wider environment of Europe, United States, other supporters of the agreement. So I don't know whether it's right for Western political leaders to say always that it's up to Ukraine to settle with Russia. The whole issue since the end of the Cold War has been NATO and the EU and Russia. And I think well, I maybe am overly, you tell me if I'm being overly optimistic, but I think it's up to Western countries to image what a possible future would look like in which Ukraine and Russia become friends. This is a fratricidal conflict. And I think we have to ask ourselves, are we feeding a fratricidal conflict in a faraway place without understanding the history, without understanding how much has gone into making this? I mean, economic sanctions. There was a blockade against the Soviet Union after the revolution. So the Western countries tried to bring about a counter-revolution through using the weapon of starvation. And the Second World War, the siege of Leningrad was based on the weapon of starvation. And Putin's older brother died in that siege, presumed to have died of starvation. So when our countries enter this debate saying we're going to degrade Russia and make them suffer, think of the chord that strikes. You know, if I were British, I would think of the Murmansk convoys during the war and the 27 million Russians who died so that the Allies would win the war, and I'd try to find some common ground. But I'm maybe, just tell me if I'm off course. But I think if we don't look for the basis for a rational discussion, it could get very much worse, and we'll be very sorry that we never tried.
Thank you very, very much, Philip. I think that is an appropriate note on which to finish this evening. It's nice to hear some views expressed by somebody of your experience and wisdom that bear very little relation, I have to say, to the views that we hear expressed in mainstream media day in, day out, and by our politicians. So I want to, it seems to me that, I mean, people in this room will be very familiar with the expression, you know, think global, act local. And I've been very struck listening to you, Philip, that you are able to speak with real authority about the global because of your wide experience in a number of different theatres of global politics, including conflict. But you are also able to speak with great authority about, if I might put it this way, your locality, an island which has experienced such tremendous violence and conflict, but also has found a way to peace. And I think that it's very interesting to hear you reflecting on the global, but bringing the experience of the Northern Ireland conflict and the peace in Northern Ireland into that global conversation. And I think that's a wonderful gift. I'd like to, on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for bringing that gift into this room and sharing it with us with such wisdom and erudition. And I haven't even mentioned your theological background. So, Philip, thank you so very much indeed.